Varlock stood at the edge of the training field, his yellow reptilian eyes narrowing as he observed the humans in silence. He had seen countless species prepare for war, had commanded thousands of troops across dozens of battlefields, and had led the Xender Dominion to victory over civilizations that once believed themselves mighty. Yet here he was, standing in a human military base on a distant planet, watching creatures he had always considered weak, unremarkable, and unworthy of the Dominion's attention. He had expected to witness disorder, lack of discipline, and outdated tactics. Instead, what he saw made his blood run cold. The humans moved like predators, their every motion controlled yet fluid, their bodies honed to perfection through suffering and endurance. Their training exercises were relentless, brutal beyond reason. He watched as two soldiers engaged in close-quarters combat, striking with precision and fury, neither willing to yield even after suffering injuries that would have caused most warriors to surrender. Another group practiced live-fire drills, moving with terrifying efficiency, never hesitating, never showing weakness. Varlock had seen elite warriors before, but there was something different about these humans. They weren't just training to fight. They were training to survive. A deep unease settled in his chest as he turned his gaze toward a massive structure at the center of the base. From within, the sound of muffled screams and explosions echoed. Yet no one outside seemed concerned. "What is that place?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. Standing beside him was Colonel Marcus Reynolds, the human officer assigned to oversee his visit. The man had an expression of quiet amusement, as if he had been expecting the question. "That," Reynolds said, folding his arms, "is where we test our soldiers against the worst possible scenarios." Varlock frowned. "Torture chambers. You break your own warriors." Reynolds chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "No, we prepare them. What's in there is not about strength or endurance. It's about learning what fear is and making sure they can function through it." Varlock had never heard a human speak with such intensity before. His people ruled through strength, through overwhelming force, through breaking the enemy before they had a chance to resist. Fear was a weapon meant for the weak. And yet, here were the humans, training in fear, mastering it, bending it to their will. He had seen soldiers trained for war, but these humans were preparing for something else. Something worse. A sudden alarm blared through the training grounds, and instantly, the soldiers on the field snapped to attention. Within seconds, they moved in unison, grabbing weapons, forming ranks, ready to engage. Varlock had never seen such an immediate response before. Even his own Dominion warriors required commands, orders, a structured deployment. But the humans? It was as if they expected an attack at any given moment. "What is happening?" Varlock demanded. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the field where a massive set of metal gates began to open. The ground shook as something emerged from the darkness. Varlock's claws tightened as he saw the creatures step forward. Hulking machines with synthetic muscle wrapped around metal frames, their red eyes glowing with artificial intelligence. War simulators, killing machines. And yet, the humans did not hesitate. Without a single order spoken, they launched into action. The battle that unfolded before Varlock's eyes was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The humans moved with a deadly grace, anticipating the machine's attacks before they came, countering with precision strikes that left the war simulators shattered within moments. Not a single human fell. Varlock had fought in countless battles. He had seen thousands of warriors lay down their lives in the name of victory. But this was something different. These humans fought not as soldiers, but as something far more dangerous. Survivors. They did not hesitate. They did not falter. They fought with a ferocity that came from a place deeper than instinct. It was something learned, something earned through suffering. "You trained them to fight machines?" Varlock asked, his voice betraying his disbelief. Reynolds shook his head. "No, we trained them to fight something worse." Varlock turned sharply to face him, his mind racing. What could possibly be worse than this? What enemy required this level of preparation? The Dominion had fought against the deadliest predators the galaxy had ever known, had crushed empires beneath its might, had conquered entire star systems. What could possibly make humans, weak, fragile, insignificant humans, train this way? Reynolds studied him for a long moment, then simply said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." A cold shiver ran down Varloc's spine. He had come here to evaluate humanity, to understand why they had become a problem for the Dominion's expansion. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never felt before. Doubt. What if the Dominion had been wrong? What if humanity's strength did not come from ambition or aggression, but from necessity? What if the galaxy had been blind to a truth that humans had known all along? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but one question still lingered in his mind. One question he needed answered. "What are you preparing for?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds met his gaze, and in his eyes, Varlock saw something that turned his blood to ice. It wasn't anger. It wasn't arrogance. It was fear, but not the kind of fear that broke warriors. No, this was something far worse. This was the fear of someone who had seen what was coming. "We don't train for war," Reynolds finally said. "We train because if we stop, we die." Varlock's breath caught in his throat. He had expected an answer filled with bravado, some declaration of human strength, a claim of superiority. But what he got was something entirely different. This wasn't about war. This wasn't about the Dominion. This was about something else, something humanity had been keeping hidden. And whatever it was enough to make even the deadliest warriors in the galaxy train as if their lives depended on it. A terrible realization crept into Varlock's mind. The Dominion had always believed itself to be the dominant force in the universe, unchallenged and undisputed. But what if that wasn't true? What if humanity had never been fighting each other? What if they had been fighting something else all along? And what if whatever they were preparing for was coming back? Varlock couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. He had seen countless battle-hardened warriors in his time, but the humans were something else entirely. They didn't just train to win. They trained as if their very existence depended on it. As he watched another group of soldiers push themselves beyond their physical limits, running drills that would break even the toughest of Dominion fighters, a question burned in his mind. What are they preparing for? He turned to Colonel Reynolds, but the human officer remained silent, his expression unreadable. That silence, more than anything, unsettled Varlock. The Dominion had conquered dozens of species, crushed civilizations that had stood for millennia, and yet never had they encountered a species that trained like this. Relentless, brutal, and utterly fearless. The human soldiers in front of him weren't just warriors. They were something worse. They were survivors of a war no one else in the galaxy seemed to know about. And if they were still preparing, then it meant only one thing. The war wasn't over. Varlock's claws tightened as he considered the implications. Had the Dominion underestimated humanity all this time? Had they mistaken silence for weakness? He watched as another training simulation began, this time in absolute darkness. The soldiers moved without hesitation, their bodies reacting to unseen threats with deadly precision. It was then that Varlock realized humans weren't training to fight the Dominion. They were training to fight something else, something that hunted in the dark, something that had already tested them before. A cold shiver ran down his spine as a terrifying thought entered his mind. What if humanity wasn't the greatest threat to the Dominion? What if they were the only ones who truly understood what the real threat was? He turned to Reynolds once more, his voice quieter this time. "Tell me the truth. What are you really preparing for?" The human officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past Varlock, his expression dark, his jaw tightening as if remembering something he wished he could forget. Then, in a voice so low that it was barely a whisper, he finally spoke. "We train because they're coming back." The word sent a chill through Varlock's entire body. They? Who were they? What enemy was so terrifying that even humans, these relentless, unbreakable fighters, lived in constant preparation for their return? For the first time in his life, Varlock felt something he had never truly experienced before. Not anger, not arrogance, not even curiosity. No, this time, it was fear. Varlock had seen fear before, but never like this. The way Reynolds spoke, the way his soldiers moved, the way every single human in this base carried themselves. It was not the fear of warriors who had lost a battle. It was the fear of survivors who had seen something so horrifying that they could never afford to stop preparing for it. They're coming back. The words echoed in Varlock's mind, twisting into something far worse than he wanted to believe. He watched as another training exercise unfolded. This time, the soldiers were moving through a simulation of a ruined city. The buildings were in flames, the sky black with smoke, the air filled with the deafening sound of distant screams. And yet, these humans didn't hesitate. They moved through the chaos with deadly precision, scanning every shadow, every broken wall, every flickering light. They weren't just fighting enemies. They were fighting something unseen, something that could strike at any moment. And it wasn't until he saw the way they aimed their weapons, not forward, but toward the darkness above, that Varlock realized something chilling. They weren't fighting another army. They were fighting something that hunted them. The Dominion had fought wars, had crushed rebellions, had conquered countless planets. But never had they fought something they couldn't see, something that lurked in the shadows, something that returned. He turned sharply to Reynolds, his mind racing. "Who are they?" he demanded, his voice harsher than intended. Reynolds remained silent, his expression unreadable, but Varlock saw it, the flicker of something deep in the human's eyes. A memory, a nightmare. The answer came not from Reynolds, but from the simulation itself. Without warning, a scream tore through the training grounds as something massive lunged from the darkness of the ruined buildings. A shape so fast, so unnatural, that even Varlock's advanced vision struggled to track it. The soldiers didn't flinch. They turned as one, unloading a storm of gunfire in perfect synchronization, cutting the creature down before it could even reach them. It collapsed with a guttural shriek, its body barely visible through the smoke, and for the first time, Varlock saw it. A nightmare of twisted limbs, razor-sharp appendages, and eyes that burned like dying embers. Not a machine, not another species, something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this galaxy. The soldiers didn't celebrate their kill. They simply reloaded, adjusted their formation, and kept moving, as if expecting more. And that's when the real horror set in for Varlock. This wasn't just a training exercise. This was a warning. This was humanity's reality. And if these creatures were real, if they were coming back, then the Dominion wasn't prepared. No one was. Varlock's breath felt heavy as he stared at the twisted corpse lying in the simulation's debris-strewn streets. Even though it was just an advanced training hologram, the creature's grotesque form felt too real, too detailed, too perfectly replicated to be anything but a memory burned into these soldiers' minds. He had fought countless enemies in his lifetime, from armored battalions to monstrous war beasts, but never had he seen something like this. It was not a soldier, not a predator, not even a conqueror. It was something worse, something designed to kill in ways that no military doctrine could counter. Its razor-sharp limbs, its unnatural movement, the way it had lunged from the darkness with pure instinct. This was no ordinary enemy. This was something that hunted intelligent life. The realization struck him harder than he expected. These things weren't just attacking humans. They were wiping them out. And yet, despite the terror such creatures should have evoked, the human soldiers didn't falter. They didn't even hesitate. They moved forward with grim determination, eyes sharp, fingers steady on the trigger. There was no panic, no disorder, only preparation. They had faced these monsters before. They had survived them. And they were training because they knew they would have to face them again. Varlock turned to Reynolds, his voice lower now, edged with something between dread and respect. "What are they?" The human officer was silent for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "We don't have a name for them," Reynolds admitted. "We call them shadows, reapers, wraiths. But none of those names really matter. What matters is what they do." He gestured toward the simulated battlefield, toward the ruined cityscape where the soldiers moved through the devastation like ghosts. "They don't fight like us. They don't have fleets. They don't negotiate. They don't conquer. They consume. They descend on worlds, strip them bare, and leave nothing behind but silence. We don't know where they come from. We don't know why they exist. All we know is that the last time they appeared, we barely survived." Varlock's throat tightened as he processed the weight of those words. He had always believed that the Dominion was the most powerful force in the galaxy, that nothing could stand against their might. But now he wasn't so sure. If what Reynolds said was true, then humanity had faced an enemy unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. And worse, they had survived it alone. No records, no warnings, no desperate calls for help. Humanity had fought these nightmares in the dark, without the rest of the galaxy even knowing. And now, if their training was any indication, they knew the war wasn't over. The Dominion had always seen humans as an anomaly, an unpredictable species that refused to bow, refused to submit. But now, Varlock was beginning to see the truth. Humans weren't just strong. They weren't just stubborn. They were preparing, not for war, not for conquest, but for survival. And if they were afraid of what was coming, then maybe, just maybe, the entire galaxy should be too. Varlock had always considered himself a warrior, a strategist, a leader who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer. But as he stood amidst the human training grounds, surrounded by soldiers who moved with the quiet efficiency of those who had survived true horror, he felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest. Doubt. He had always believed in the Dominion's superiority, its control over lesser species, its unshakable grip on power. But watching these humans train, seeing the cold, unwavering determination in their eyes, he realized something that sent a chill through him. The Dominion had never conquered humanity. They had overlooked them. They had dismissed their silence, their lack of territorial expansion, their reluctance to engage in unnecessary war as weakness. But now, standing here, watching the way these soldiers fought in the simulated ruins of a city that might have once been their home, he understood the truth. Humanity wasn't silent because they were weak. They were silent because they were hiding something. They had suffered something so terrible, so unimaginable, that they had chosen secrecy over seeking aid, not out of shame, not out of arrogance, but because they knew no one in the galaxy would understand. No one would believe them. And as Varlock watched another monstrous creature lunge from the darkness, another horrifying abomination with too many limbs and empty, soulless eyes, he finally understood why. These creatures weren't invaders. They weren't an enemy that could be reasoned with, or even fought like a conventional force. They were something worse, something ancient, something that had already tested humanity and very nearly wiped them out. The battle was swift, brutal. The soldiers moved with terrifying precision, unleashing coordinated fire that tore the creature apart before it could even reach them. No hesitation, no fear, just the grim efficiency of those who had learned the hard way that failure meant extinction. And Varlock, for the first time in his long career, found himself gripping the hilt of his blade, not because he was preparing for battle, but because his hands had begun to tremble. This wasn't war. This was survival training. And if humanity was still preparing, still sharpening their skills, still waiting, then it could mean only one thing. The war wasn't over. The threat wasn't gone. And the Dominion, in all its arrogance, had no idea what kind of nightmare was lurking just beyond the edges of their empire. For the first time in his life, Varlock felt something more dangerous than doubt. He felt helpless, And as he turned to Reynolds, searching for answers, he saw something even more terrifying in the human officer's gaze. Not fear, not desperation. Acceptance. The kind of acceptance that only came from those who already knew the inevitable truth. The kind that came from those who had already seen the end and had chosen to fight it anyway. Varlock could no longer ignore the truth staring him in the face. The Dominion had always viewed humanity as an anomaly, a species that refused to expand aggressively, that didn't chase power like the others. But now, as he watched yet another simulation unfold, this time in the deep, suffocating darkness of a collapsed underground city, he realized humanity's true nature had never been about conquest. It had always been about survival. The soldiers moved with eerie precision, their weapons adjusting to every flicker of movement, every unnatural sound that echoed through the ruins. They didn't panic, didn't hesitate, even as the shadows themselves seemed to shift and coil around them. And then the attack came. Fast, silent, merciless. A blur of jagged limbs, a ripple of movement too fast for the eye to fully process. One of the monstrous creatures dropped from the ceiling, slamming into the nearest soldier with terrifying force, its razor-sharp claws tearing through armor like paper. But the soldier didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. Instead, before the creature could finish its kill, his squadmates unleashed a storm of gunfire so precise, so inhumanly coordinated, that the monster was reduced to nothing but a charred, twitching corpse within seconds. Varlock barely had time to process what had happened before another creature lunged from the ruins, and then another and another. They came from the walls, the ceilings, the rubble itself. Horrors with too many eyes, too many teeth, too much hunger. Any other army would have collapsed under the onslaught. Any other species would have broken, screamed, died. But the humans? They fought like something beyond warriors. They fought like they expected this. They moved in perfect synchronization, covering each other's blind spots, adapting instantly to every new attack. There was no fear, no hesitation, just raw, practiced survival instinct. And that was when it hit Varlock with the force of a collapsing star. This wasn't just training. These weren't theoretical drills or fabricated war games. This was rehearsal. Humanity had fought these things before. They had learned, adapted, endured. And now they were preparing to do it again. Not just on one planet, not just on one battlefield, but on a galactic scale. The Dominion had spent centuries believing they were the apex predators of the universe. But as Varlock looked at the monstrous corpses littering the training field, at the emotionless precision of the human soldiers, at the cold, knowing stare of Colonel Reynolds, he realized a far more horrifying truth. Humanity wasn't preparing to fight for survival anymore. They were preparing to fight for everyone's survival. Because whatever these creatures were, they weren't just coming for Earth. They were coming for everything. And humanity was the only species that truly understood what that meant. Varlock felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest as he processed the horrifying reality before him. The Dominion had spent centuries crushing rebellions, conquering worlds, enforcing control over countless species with overwhelming military might. Yet, in all its vast history, in all its recorded wars and victories, there was nothing in its archives that spoke of an enemy like this. These creatures weren't invaders seeking territory. They weren't rival empires looking for power. They were something far worse, something that consumed, something that erased civilizations as if they had never existed. And humanity, against all odds, had faced them alone. As another wave of creatures surged forward in the training simulation, the human soldiers reacted with terrifying efficiency. No wasted movement, no frantic shouting, just calculated survival. They didn't fight like soldiers following orders. They'd fought like people who had seen this nightmare before. And that was what unsettled Varlock the most. He had seen fear before, soldiers trembling under fire, commanders second-guessing their tactics, species on the brink of annihilation. But humans weren't afraid. They were prepared. They had already lived through the worst. They knew what was coming. Reynolds stood beside him, arms crossed, watching his soldiers with an unreadable expression. Varlock turned to him, his voice quieter now, the weight of what he had seen finally sinking in. "How did you survive?" The human commander exhaled, as if the question itself carried a burden too heavy to hold. "We didn't," Reynolds said finally. "Not all of us." Gaze flicked back to the battlefield, where the soldiers were finishing off the last of the simulated monsters, their weapons still hot, their eyes still cold. "The first time they came, we lost entire worlds before we even understood what we were fighting. They don't negotiate. They don't retreat. They don't stop. They wiped out entire colonies before we learned how to push them back. And by then, it was already too late for millions." Varlock's throat tightened. The Dominion had never heard of such a war. Not a single distress call, not a single desperate plea for aid had ever reached their borders. "Why didn't you ask for help?" Reynolds let out a humorless chuckle. "Help? From who? The Dominion? The Galactic Council?" We knew what they'd say. They'd say we were exaggerating, that we were lying, that we were trying to manipulate the political board. "We were alone, Commander. So we did the only thing we could." He gestured toward the battlefield, where the soldiers were already resetting the simulation, ready to run it again. "We adapted. We trained. We learned." His voice lowered, his expression darkening. "And we made sure that next time, we wouldn't just survive. We'd be ready." Varlock stared at him, at the brutal truth reflected in his words. The Dominion had seen humans as an unpredictable force, a species too dangerous to be ignored, but too stubborn to conquer. But now he understood. Humanity had never been unpredictable. They had never been reckless or irrational. They had simply seen the end of the galaxy before anyone else had. And now, as they trained in silence, as they sharpened their weapons and steeled their minds for the war to come, one thing was certain. When the darkness returned, when the creatures emerged once more from the void to consume everything in their path, humanity would be waiting for them. And this time, they wouldn't be fighting alone. Varlock had never felt fear like this before, not the fear of battle, not the fear of death, but the fear of knowing he had been blind to the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced. The Dominion had always believed itself to be the apex of power, the ruling force that dictated the fate of lesser species. But now, standing amidst humanity's brutal training grounds, watching the silent, disciplined soldiers reset their battlefield as if preparing for an inevitable apocalypse, he realized the truth. The Dominion wasn't ready for this war. Humanity was. His mind raced with questions, but one burned brighter than the rest. What happens when the creatures return? He turned to Reynolds, the human officer who had remained composed even as the horrors of the past were spoken aloud. "How much time do we have?" he asked, his voice lower than before. For the first time, Reynolds' expression wavered. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker of something grim behind his eyes. But it was enough. "Not enough," Reynolds admitted. "We've been watching the edges of our territory. We've seen the signs, the missing ships, the quiet colonies, the patterns that we recognize even if the rest of the galaxy doesn't. It's happening again." The weight of those words settled over Varlock like a suffocating fog. If humanity had already fought these creatures before, had lost entire worlds to them, had barely survived their first encounter, then the rest of the galaxy was standing on the edge of a catastrophe they didn't even know existed. The Dominion was too arrogant, too comfortable in its power to see what was coming. And by the time they did, it would be too late. Varlock clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palms. His entire life had been devoted to war, to proving his strength, to securing his place in the Dominion's unshakable empire. But now, all of that felt insignificant. Titles, ranks, political maneuvering, none of it would matter when the darkness came for them. When the monsters arrived, they wouldn't care about who ruled what, who had the largest fleet, who had the most territory. They would only consume, And as much as Varlock hated to admit it, as much as the thought unsettled every belief he had ever held, humanity was the only species prepared to stop them. He exhaled slowly, his mind already shifting from denial to action. "We need to warn the Dominion," he said, forcing himself to speak past the growing unease in his chest. "They need to know what's coming." Reynolds' expression didn't change. "And what do you think they'll do with that information?" he asked. "Prepare, rally their fleets, or will they dismiss it as human paranoia, just another attempt to shake the balance of power?" Varlock wanted to argue, wanted to believe that his people, his empire, would listen, but he had been part of the Dominion's command for too long. He knew how they thought. They wouldn't believe it, not until it was too late, not until the screaming started. He looked back at the battlefield, at the human soldiers standing in perfect formation, their weapons still warm from simulated combat. They weren't waiting for permission. They weren't waiting for someone to save them. They were preparing for the war that no one else could see. And in that moment, Varlock made his decision. If the Dominion refused to see the truth, then he would make them, even if it meant betraying everything he had ever known. Because if humanity was right, if the darkness was truly coming, then alliances, rivalries, and politics no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered now was survival.